Nashville Design Week is a platform for bold collaborations and conversations that promote idea sharing, engage and educate the public, and strengthen our city's design culture. We shine a spotlight on designers who are shaping the city's future and facilitate critical conversation about the industry's growth and impact.
2020 has challenged us in every way. A tornado, a pandemic, and a long overdue reckoning with racial inequity. And as we close in on a formative election, we are excited to focus on the power of design to reshape communities and to actively support equity. We are proud to introduce a diverse range of speakers covering everything from racial injustice and inequity to diversity and inclusion, connectivity, and allyship, all through the lens of design.
We're fortunate to partner with design leaders who are invested in the future of Nashville's design community. These leaders see Nashville Design Week as essential and support making design discourse accessible to all. Thank you endlessly to our 2020 sponsors for helping us bring Nashville Design Week to life. Thank you to founding silver sponsor, Hastings. Hastings is a boutique architecture and interior design firm of 75 professionals who are deeply committed to the service of clients, producing award-winning, thoughtful, and impactful architecture. Thank you to silver sponsor, Watkins College of Art and O'Moore College of Architecture and Design at Belmont University. The Watkins College of Art and the O'Moore College of Architecture and Design celebrate the power of art and design to transform people, communities, cultures, and the world. Thank you to our copper sponsors, Elevated Outcomes, Interface, Smith G Studio, and Textures Nashville. Thank you to our bronze sponsors, Aberdeen Studio, Alfred Williams & Company, Circa Creative Studios, Dade, EOA Architects, Earl Swenson Associates, Emmanuel Zeitlin Architects.
And thank you to our media partners, Dezeen, Lightning 100, and Nashville Interiors, and to creative directors Lindsay and Alan Lassiter.
Nashville Design Week is proud to be a fiscally sponsored project of the Arts and Business Council of Greater Nashville, a nonprofit organization. Nashville Design Week is an entirely volunteer effort made possible by the tireless dedication of our team. Now, let's get started.
Hi, everyone. My name is Keisha Miller. I am a volunteer program coordinator for Nashville Design Week 2020. On behalf of the Nashville Design Week team, I'd like to welcome you to Whitespace, a conversation on race and design. The host for today's event is AIGA Nashville, and the panel will be moderated by Kalina Sales, who is a professor of design at Tennessee State University and the Diversity and Inclusion Director at AIGA Nashville. We thank you for being a part of Nashville Design Week 2020. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kalina.
All right. I went back and I listened to watched the documentary Helvetica, because there's a part in the documentary that really was interesting. I think drew a really interesting parallel to our conversation today. So type designer Massimo Vanelli said, we think typography is black and white. Typography is really white. It is a space between the blacks that really makes it. It's like music. It's not the notes. It's a space between the notes that makes the music. And I would add that the beauty of typography is that white space is ever changing and constantly in flux to support really dynamic messages. In contrast, the design industry's lack of diversity has been stagnant and creating an overabundance of space between Black and minority designers. Therefore, we've been creating work absent of minority voices and experiences. So it begs the question, why is there such a lack of diversity in the design industry? In 2019, AIGA, with the support of Google, did a design census, and these were the results. So I'm interested to talk about some of this and much more with our panel today. So I'd love for them to introduce themselves and let us know a little bit about their background and experience in design, and then we'll jump into the questions after that. In the meantime, as the conversation is going on, if you have questions, please take advantage of the Q&A or chat features. And then at the end of our conversation, we will we will pull from some of those questions. So Bobby, would you mind getting us started?
Sure. Well, thank you, Kalina. Thank you, Kesha, for having me today. I'm Bobby Martin, and I am one of the co-founders of Champions Design. Can you see everything? Okay, cool. I'm watching the screen and trying to get used to yet another interface as we go through all of these different virtual sessions. So yeah, this is some of my work. I started Champions about 10 years ago, and actually in March of 2020, we celebrated our 10th anniversary. We're formerly known as OCD, the original Champions of Design. In March, when we had our 10-year anniversary, we took that as an opportunity to rebrand ourselves, to further double down on the ability to kind of champion the things that we really believe in, and people and clients and businesses that are out there doing something that's really special in the world. I had the great opportunity to work with, universities such as Dartmouth College, as you see here, and the New York Times and the New York Times Magazine, as well as artists like Hank Willis Thomas, whose monograph is also shared here. What I get really excited about is building brand identity systems. And so, I think it goes back to just me having this background as an illustrator, then into graphic design. And so being able to build logos and then systems around it is really the best of both worlds. And damn right, I've experienced a lot of racism, a lot of prejudice, a lot of ups and downs over the course of my career. And so I'm really happy to be able to talk about some of those challenges that we faced. And what I'm really excited about is to be able to talk about what we can do to then overcome them. So thank you again for having me. And I'm really excited to be a part of this discussion with some of my design heroes here as well. So looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bobby. And next, Mitzi.
Yes, can everyone hear me? Okay, cool. Yeah, so my name's Mitzi. I am an interaction and visual designer, and I do some illustration and UX and whatnot. I'm trying to become like a master Swiss Army knife designer that can just do anything. And I actually used to work at HP. I left about a month ago, and before that, I co-founded We're the Black Designers, which was originally a conference that was basically talking about the experience of becoming a designer as a Black person and all of the problems in between that to kind of like overcome all these obstacles to even be considered that. And before I did that, I went to school in Savannah, College of Art and Design. So I'm pretty young. My career is just starting out. But I kind of discovered my love for accessibility and music technology and education, as well as diversity inclusion through some of that program. Just like Bobby C. Martin, I think I've kind of like experienced some racism in terms of just like design curriculum, as well as just like, microaggressions going into the workforce, which is kind of why I started We're the Black Designers, to have a conversation about that, but also to have a safe space for Black designers to come to and emote and just heal and educate themselves and empower themselves to become the best designer that they can become, while also providing resources and support to kind of like get them there, get them to wherever they need to be. So that's currently the work that I am doing right now.
Amazing. Thank you, Mitzi. And Jen.
Hi, my name is Jin Kim, and I'm an art director working here in Nashville at Statement Brand Agency. I'm a director and designer by day and a hand letterer by night. I've been working in the industry as a designer for about 7 years now, and my personal work lately has been focused on finding mindfulness and self-betterment in our daily lives. You can see some of my work on my Instagram at Jen's Desk. I'm pretty active on there, so all of it is very fresh work. And I'll share a little bit about my life. I'm married and have a 6-month-old baby boy, and we also have a long-haired dachshund that has a weird bark that sounds something in between like a squeaker toy or hiccups. But I'm super excited to be here. This is actually my first time speaking at any kind of event. So very honored that AIGA Nashville invited me to speak today, especially about such an important and heavy topic. So I hope we get into some raw discussions that challenge us a bit to think outside our comfort zones.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jen. Forrest?
Thank you, Kalina. Jen, that was an amazing introduction. So you're already a pro. I was laughing. I'm totally loose now. I was all tense, wondering if my camera's going to work. And now I'm thinking about the bark of your dog. So hi, everyone. So glad to be here. I'm Forrest Young. I'm global principal at Wolf Olins, which means I just oversee design in most of our major projects. And I like to think of, my day job as wildly unpredictable. And I like to think that sometimes very interesting design challenges and briefs are wrapped in very mundane things, and very interesting things are oftentimes very boring. And so you never know what something looks like at face value. You have to truly interrogate it and find out that ultimately it's a conversation about people. So I think some of the work is, recent stuff that we did for Uber, and as well as an ongoing series in the top right, which is what I call the future apocalypse, which is us thinking of, if we don't figure out the answers to some of these questions, a lot of our great monuments will be, lost to the sands of time. And so just thinking about what are we all fighting for, and what is the type of society that we're actually building towards, and how do we move away from, something you alluded to earlier, Kalina, stereotypography, not even just the space between letter forms, but the actual letter forms themselves have a semiotic history of otherness, exoticism, distributions of power, et cetera, et cetera. So like you, Jen, I'm excited to get raw, and honored to be on such a lovely panel. This is probably the best panel I think I've been on this year. I mean, any panel with Mitzi is amazing, but this is truly an exceptional panel.
Wow, thank you, Forrest. That was great. I'm honestly, I'm in awe of the panel as well. So bear with me as I, am kind of a fan of all you guys and kind of having this conversation as well. So we'll jump right in. I think I'd like to just start by asking you guys, what was your entry point into design? I mean, as we kind of discussed, the lack of diversity, we've all entered into this industry at some point. And so I'm interested to know what those pathways were for you guys. Anyone can jump in.
I can start because mine's probably the most embarrassing. And I think in panels like this, with such courageous panelists, we should just be as raw and vulnerable as possible. So I'm not going to tell you a story of, perfection and kind of leapfrogging into, perfect roles. I think it very much was a set of stumbling. Anybody who works in branding is by definition made two misfires. No one's a 7-year-old and says, one day I want to grow up and I want to go into branding. Branding by definition means you tried at least one or two things and you failed epically at one or two things. What I will say is that my foray into design actually came by accident. Some of you may know the story, but for those who don't, I entered a furniture design competition, won a furniture design competition. I'm not an industrial designer, but I was bored and I made a chair and won a competition. And I thought to myself, what does this mean? Should I become an industrial designer? Should I become a chair designer? And I thought, well, the poster was the most interesting part about it. I guess it's this thing called graphic design. Well, I had a misconception because I work in a library, at a very, very hot library, where I used to take the book jackets and off of the books, and I used to put them up in the stacks. And I remember seeing a monograph of Paul Rand, and I looked at this picture of Paul Rand, and I go, oh my gosh, I can't believe there are so many amazing, and Bobby C. Martin's going to pull this off the shelf in perfect timing. So I looked at this exact book, and I thought, my goodness, he looks just like, a young Stokely Carmichael. He's out there, just talking about the issues of this day. He must be some kind of civil rights hero for the corporate elite. And I thought, wow, Yale University must be the place where that's where all the Black designers are at. They're in New Haven, Connecticut. So I was asking that same question. So I went to New Haven, Connecticut, and it was not that. But that was my foray into design, was actually a series of misconceptions and misreadings. I think because I was just trying to see role models that weren't there.
I think it's great that Bobby had that book there. But
well, and I've told Forrest this story a couple of times because it's amazing. Because I kind of had a similar experience. Like when you see pictures of people, you're looking for people that look like you, and I had some of the same maybe embarrassing questions. I guess I'll just go right into my background. So thanks, Forrest, for sharing that. I like to say that I'm a country boy from Virginia. I grew up in Hampton. My dad taught at Hampton University for 35 years. I basically grew up on campus. And both of my parents and most of my family are educators. My mom, my dad, my sister. And but I was the kid who liked to draw. So when I was in high school, I loved basketball. I was really obsessed with basketball, but it wasn't. I quickly learned that it wasn't going to be an NBA career for me. And the other thing that I loved to do was draw. I would draw, cars and really soup them up or pimp them out, as you like to say nowadays. Or I would draw a little. I remember drawing a teddy bear for a girl that I had a crush on when I was like 13, and it was a thing that it became my sport. It became the thing that I could do really well, better than most others. And I was also still kind of had this idea of competition in mind because I had grown up in sports in such a really heavy sports town. And so I've always treated how I approached design and art very much like how I would have treated, going to a basketball game or practicing for a team. So when I went to college at Virginia Commonwealth in Richmond, I first went in for illustration because I like to draw. It was a very easy segue. And a lot of people say, well, go into illustration. You can make money in illustration where you're not an artist and there's this kind of starving artist kind of syndrome. So go into illustration and you can make money drawing things. And then as I started to get into illustration, I had a couple of really fantastic professors, two Black professors, especially at Virginia Commonwealth, Robert Foster and Alex Bostic, who were exceptional. And they really helped they were just people that were easy to get along with. And so that was great as a teacher and as a student kind of looking for role models. But then I kind of segued into graphic design because similar to art, then I started to hear that graphic design, you can get a full-time job, whereas illustrators, you'll be freelancing. And so go get a full-time job. And knowing the kind of background that I had of both my parents being in education and having these long-term positions, I went in the full-time job route. When I went into graphic design at Virginia Commonwealth, none of the teachers looked like me, but I did know that the teachers were exceptional professors. I had Phil Meggs, who literally wrote a history of graphic design. I had some other really fantastic teachers who were able to teach me the fundamentals of design, of graphic design. Now, looking back on it, those fundamentals were very much based in Swiss and European typography, German and Bauhaus ethos. But then at the same time, we were often tasked with the challenge of going out and finding what is interesting out there in the world. And in Richmond, Virginia, there was a lot that was really interesting that kind of really spoke to Blackness and the things that I really cared about. There's a couple of different historically Black universities that also have incredible art programs or museums. So I was able to meet a lot of artists, John Biggers and Jacob Lawrence and Elizabeth Catlett and others growing up. And so having this access was really great. It gave me the ambition to then go work in New York City because I didn't want to continue to stay in Virginia. I just had this idea of going to kind of, I guess, the bright lights, big city. And so I went to New York. I worked in magazines, and lo and behold, one of the top magazine art directors was somebody whose father worked with my father at Hampton University, who was Rem Duplessis, who was working at GQ magazine at the time. And he was able to really show me the ropes when I moved to New York. And it was super helpful. And we still stay in touch today, even though he's at Apple, a creative director at Apple. So along the way, I continued to learn and grow by looking at experiences outside of the textbook, as well as really understanding the fundamentals of what graphic design and communication were. I went to grad school at Virginia at the School of Visual Arts here in New York City. And there is where I had further access to really incredible professors and incredible points of view, because we had such a diverse background of students that were part of the program. And so I then evolved into branding. I don't know if I totally agree with Forrest's, nobody grows up wanting to go in branding. It wasn't something that I thought about at the time, but now looking back on it, there were things that I was really drawn to as a kid, like decks of cards, the way that those look, or the soda cans that we were drinking out of, and just redesigning those, even though I didn't know what redesigning was. I did end up going into branding. One of my professors, I had two incredible professors at School of Visual Arts. One was Brian Collins, who I went to work with for 2 years at Ogilvy, and the other was Paula Scheer, who then helped me into a world beyond the Ogilvy and the advertising and brand world, which was the design director of Jazz Lincoln Center. And after those experiences, I was able to then go into starting my own company. That is what we did 10 years ago, which I talked about in my intro. So it was a long background. Thank you for bearing with me. But there were a lot of really important people along the way that helped me to get to where I am and the things that I'm doing.
Wow, yeah, those are some amazing mentors. Wow, yeah, I want to kind of circle back around to that in a few. Yeah, what about you, Jen or Mitzi?
Yeah, I would probably say my journey into design is a little bit similar, like I would say parallel to Bobby's, in the sense that I actually got to design through classical music. So I played it my entire life, and went to college. I went to a conservatory for 2 years, but when I got to Boston, because I went to Boston Conservatory, that's kind of when my racial disparity was awoken inside of me, and I was like, okay, there's a lot of racial issues around me. How can I solve that with classical music, even though there was a lot of racial issues within that? And then I, through just kind of some experiences of just not really liking it, and through classical music and not really winning competitions and not being that great at it, I was like, okay, this is clearly not for me, because even though I can say that I play it and I have the skills, I'm not at a competitive level like everybody else is, in the sense of just being successful. And I went to my parents, and I was afraid at first because they spent basically 18 years investing in this, and I was like, I don't know if I want to do this anymore. And they were like, yeah, we kind of felt that, but you have to choose something else. And just like Bobby, I would look at posters, and I was like, these posters didn't just appear out of nowhere. Somebody made them. I don't know what software was. I don't know how they did it. They coded it. I used to think that people coded posters for some reason. I didn't believe in drawing it, scanning it. I was like, I don't know how this is possible, but I'm curious. And so I was like, okay, I want to do something with art and technology, and it seems like making posters sits at the center of that. And so I did a bunch of school tours, and then ended up at SCAD, where I majored in graphic design, but I was still on the graphic design route. And I was like, okay, this is getting closer to where I want to be, in the sense of using some type of artistic skill or creativity to solve for issues that I'm passionate about, but it's not on the dot. It's getting closer, but it's not there specifically. And then I took a human computer interaction class with Yoon-Hee Chung. And that was a class that made it very clear to me that UX and interaction with the combination of visual design is exactly what I want to do, because it helps solve issues and conceptualize and everything. So that's when I went into that. And I also found that when I found that passion, and just clicked, I got really good at things, and I was winning these competitions, and I was like, okay, I'm actually really good at this. And because I really love it a lot, it really translates into me producing things super well. And so after that, with everything that went on, after I graduated, I was still okay, this is great, but I'm still feeling a little bit unfulfilled. I feel like I kind of touched the surface of what design is, which I feel like I just kind of have, created tactile things, but there's something deeper, because there's the design of spaces that also affect certain populations of people. And I want to get to the core of that, because I feel like that's where a lot of issues stem. And that's where a lot of these disparities happen, is clearly through all of these different intersections. But I wasn't taught about that, because I was taught to basically have skills to work in the workforce and not think about anything beyond that, which is kind of like how that all built up to Where the Black Designers, because I think it was just like a combination of like experiences, not seeing myself in different places, but then also connecting that back to design in the sense that like these spaces were designed by somebody. So we have to get to that core of just like design to kind of like connect all of that to really solve all these issues and have these conversations. And that's kind of how I got into that.
Thank you. We got some SCAD love in the chat too. But okay, Jen, what was your entry point?
Okay, so for me, when I was going through school, I was always talented at art, but I never thought of it as a possible career for myself because of many reasons, but one being that I didn't see anyone who I could identify with working in the creative industry like Mitzi, Forrest, and Bobby have mentioned. So when I was in college, I tried going into a science major, but I absolutely hated it. And it was something I knew I could do if I put a lot of effort in, but I wouldn't be happy. So in my sophomore year of college, I had this epiphany at one point where I realized if I could just pursue art, something that I'm already talented in and loved doing, I believed I could get a lot further in life. But I was very worried because being successful as an artist, it sounds really hard. And you're scared of being the starving artist. So I researched jobs that are art related that could help me just survive in the world. So one of the first areas I looked into was architecture. And I took a calculus class and got a C in it. And if you're Asian, that's pretty much failing. So pivoted, did some more research, and ended up looking into graphic design. So my entry was my intro class, design class in college. Prior to that class, I didn't know anything about design. I didn't know what logos were or any of that, but it was something I ended up being pretty good at and found a passion in, and I never looked back.
Thank you, guys. So I heard you guys mention education, mentors, and kind of those things that contributed to, what led you to where you are now. And I reflect sometimes on my students. Like I said, I teach at an HBCU, and they're pursuing graphic design. Most of them are Black students from inner city cities like Atlanta, Chicago, Memphis. And I think about how culture and language and some of the things, that aesthetic kind of preferences have really gotten in the way or hindered their journeys into the design industry. So I'm curious to know what your thoughts are in terms of what contributes to that lack of diversity. As I said, we've all made it in, at some point through different entryways, but what's holding other minorities or other kind of other designers of color back from entering this space?
I want to build off of something that I think everyone's mentioned, and I think Bobby did a great job of kind of taking us through his journey. And first of all, I just love the vulnerability and the transparency of this panel. So I think we just keep it going. I think that if I think about some of the chords that people have been talking about, one is parental reinforcement. I know for a lot of Black and brown families, including my own, that going to art school or pursuing that was just frowned upon. You're validating, the contribution of an artist or a designer against, a doctor or a lawyer or other types of other kind of validated positions. And the profession itself is largely misunderstood. I mean, there are people making insane amounts of money doing what we do, but we just don't know about it. So in some ways, the starving artist, I think, has been mentioned, by two or more people, and it's this kind of fear of kind of failing and having this public failure, because if your parents, or have professions and jobs, and you don't want to be the generation that kind of drops off. I do think that within, art schools and art education, for those that are going on, getting financial aid or getting student loans, you're thinking about what happens the moment that I graduate, perhaps more than other students that aren't worrying about those things. And so in some ways, your education suffers because you may come in with the best portfolios, but you're starting to think about what is that vocational stepping stone. You have visiting critics who may or may not be, steeped in a European canon or looking at work through a very particular Eurocentric lens. So you may not even be understood in terms of the forms you're being drawn to or making, to your point, Kalina, about language and references. And then I also think that network effects compound when you graduate, that all of a sudden there are students that suddenly have access to interviews and backdoor channels that a lot of students, students of color don't have, that they're kind of going by the job bulletin board and wondering why those jobs are no longer available. And so I think it's a lot of those things that contribute to what they call a broken funnel or the problems of talent acquisition. But I don't think it's the problem of there aren't enough candidates. I think that the entire, the journey of becoming a designer or a contributor to our profession has so many drop-off points that we need to kind of look at under a microscope.
Yeah,
I think, go ahead.
No. I was going to say that I agree with Forrest, and I think it's also have been written by Cheryl D. Miller, highlighting and articulating that same exact problem. I also want to say that I think it has to do with just like early childhood education and that system like not really supporting creativity, and also even adhering to how other people learn, because I kind of start to understand that the reason why I was really drawn to creativity is how that entire system is catered to one specific learning, and that there's like no exploration for that when it comes to, I would say, public school, systems, because I had the privilege of having parents, because they're both from Ivory Coast, that were more unconventional in the sense that they were like, as long as she's happy, she can do whatever, even though I was getting side comments from relatives that were just like, your parents are living, you do whatever you want, but you should go be a doctor and a lawyer. But they gave me that support to explore. But I think it's weird that even with all of that exploration that I had, I still didn't know what design was, because my early childhood education did not provide those tools and support for me to do that. And I think even in public school systems, we see a lot of these counselor roles being filled by white people who just kind of like narrow down the perspective of Black and brown kids. And so I think there also needs to be more representation in that early childhood education to basically expand that view, and also support kids and persuade their parents that, this is a career that you can go into. It goes along so many other disciplines. Like, we see all these creatives major in like computer science and human computer interaction and whatnot, because it kind of is a science to be able to do all of this. So I think that it also comes down to creating that space within high schools and middle schools and elementary schools to help kids understand that they can do that and explore this space, I think.
I totally agree. I think the access can and should shift down to high schools and middle schools. And one of the big challenges that we're seeing is not all of the middle schools and high schools have art programs and design programs. And so that's something that a lot of people are then having to go outside of what they're getting in school to be able to learn these things. And if you don't know that they exist, then you're not going to be learning about design. I think I'm maybe a little bit of a in between generationally in the panel here. I'm a Gen Xer growing up in the 90s, and there were a lot of overachievers in high school and in college. But I'll just be honest with you, a lot of my friends were middle of the road. They didn't have the, as you mentioned, Jen, like if you get a C, you're out. I mean, and to some of my friends, like getting a C was like, great, I passed. And so I think because of that, there's a lot of my best friends that I went to college with that actually never made it out of college. And they're doing different things now, but they didn't make it to graduation. And they weren't in the design field. They were in other fields. They were in maybe some of the more typical places, psychology and education and things like that. And they ended up just not meeting the standard within the college that I went to. I'm also curious about there were a good amount of folks that I went to college with that were in classes with me that I don't know what they're doing now. There were people that I went to in art school or my art classes in high school. There were folks that I was in high school with that were, a couple brothers were in class with me, and some of them went to college for design and others didn't, but they're not in the design industry now. So there is, I think I want to make sure that we're not placing all of the blame on parents saying go into these professions and not design. I think that there is, one, a lack of understanding of what graphic design is or what it can pay. And then there's a misstep from going to college and then going into design professionally. Because there's a lot of people that I have known throughout my career that were in it, but then you don't hear from them so much now. And this might be something that you deal with a good amount, Kalina, being a professor at historically Black universities, because some of the cats I'm talking about went to Black schools, went to Norfolk State, went to Hampton, went to others. And so I think part of what we also need to look at is what are the resources that these Black schools are getting? What are the resources that these schools that aren't the Parsons and the SVAs and the SCADs and the Yales, what are they, what access is being provided to be able to inspire people and to push people into roles that they didn't know that were even existing. And so I think that's maybe a challenge for all of us here on the panel, but I think it's also something for us to continue to look at what is happening to those that go to school and are actually studying design and graphic design. Where are they after they graduate? And maybe they're in the in-house corporate world, so we don't hear from them as much. But I think that there is a little bit of a gap there that we should be figuring out what to do about.
I would also say that there's also a gap when it comes to financial implications too, because from going to a design school, it's really expensive, right? And so I was seeing all of my white counterparts take their time, switch majors, and just do all these things when it was like, when I transferred from a music school, I was like, this is it. I was like, the next thing I choose, that's kind of what I have to stick with, because I do not have any more money to basically explore anything else creative if I don't get it right this time. So it's like, we need to also look at how finances basically block Black and brown kids, especially because Cheryl really elegantly said that one of the implications is finances, and that when Black and brown kids get to the university level, they are not financially set up to compete with their white counterparts.
I would just argue that some of them are not. I think we need, I think Blackness has a lot of different entry points and is kind of looked at in a lot of different ways from different people. And I think we have to be careful about not brushing, these things with a broad stroke. There are a lot. I think finance is a big challenge. Not everyone has the same challenges with finances, and I think that's like, but they're still falling through the cracks. So, there's like, what can we do to help with finances and financial aid and those types of things? But then also, what do we do to just help with, what happens when people are graduating and then have to go into the work world? Because I think there are design programs at schools that aren't, the typical art schools.
Right.
So and what happens to them?
And I agree. And what I'm trying to say is finances are one of the implications, not that it's a generalization for all Black and brown kids. But as you are highlighting one of these things, this is also another thing that we need to pay attention to as well as highlight, especially because within the community that has kind of arisen throughout the Black designers, that's kind of one of the pain points that we're trying to solve is how can we provide free resources so that finances is not a huge problem for some of these people, not generally, because of course, people can't afford it, but that's kind of the thing that we need to tackle and we can't ignore for some other people that want to go down this route.
Yeah, and I'll actually chime in there too, and say that, the students that I teach, again, it's an HBCU, the lack of generational wealth does impact quite a bit. I have students that don't have their own laptops, until they're a senior. They don't have software. And so you think about the hours that they've not been able to work on their craft, because they are relying on just using time in class. And, that lack of access ends up, killing their portfolios. And then I think to Mitzi's point, about how expensive schools are, and then the kind of implications that has on your choices once you graduate, and how serious you are about, landing a job in a certain kind of income bracket. So yeah, it definitely does not impact all of my students, but it certainly, it comes up quite a bit. And then I think Bobby or Forrest mentioned kind of the lack of support at certain types of institutions compared to other universities. So Jen, I didn't mean to chime in before you got a chance to speak, but.
Oh no, you're fine.
Okay.
I was just gonna say, I would almost go as far as to say that the creative field is almost seen as a luxury career path, because it's often viewed as though you need someone else to invest in you, or else you're going to become a starving artist. Because what we've been taught is that it's near impossible to be successful as a creative, let alone a creative that doesn't have the privileges of maybe a white person. But as far as the industry goes, one specific example I can give out of how we're perpetuating this idea is when we don't pay our interns. I know this might seem like a small thing for a business owner, but who do you think are the type of people who can afford to work an internship unpaid? So, these are the type of people who don't have to worry about finances growing up and can go to private art school.
Yeah, I mean, not all internships are unpaid. I think you brought up internships, and I think internships are a huge way for people in general to be able to get experience before graduating. And because my dad was a professor, he had this. He would just be very proactive about getting me opportunities and saying, okay, this is what you're going to do. And so I think I remember having internships. I had an internship at a newspaper because that was really the most creative thing you could do in my neck of the woods at the time. And I don't remember getting paid there, but it was over the summer. And so what I would do is I interned at a place for a certain amount of time, and then I would go and do my summer job. And so I was using my summer job was giving me the income, while then the internship was being really part of my education. And eventually I was able to actually get paid internships and co-op programs. And so some of the schools will have, they have offices that are able to help with that. One of the interesting things is one school that comes to us quite often at our company comes to us quite often as part of this kind of intern program that they have. But most of the other interns that we take on are because people have just emailed us, and we pay our interns $15 an hour, which is minimum wage in New York City. And there's a lot of hours there, so it can add up. So I think, now as designers and agencies are being more aware of the need to pay interns. And so it's a way to be able to, one, get paid and also get the experience. And then I think as far as not getting paid for an internship, maybe that's something that can be done over the summer when you're able to do another job and get an internship at the experiences as well.
But I don't think Jen is saying, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think Jen is saying that all internships are unpaid, but it's like, again, it just goes back to that finance implication that some people can't afford unpaid internships. And unfortunately, that realm has to do with Black and brown people. So it's just like and then also some of these internships require interns to relocate to really expensive cities and to be unpaid and not even paid enough to basically spend a few months in these hubs, which are basically New York, San Francisco, or LA, which have housing crises because they're so expensive, there has to be a conversation about how we can bring in most of that diverse talent, but allow them to have those skills and learn and create that environment where they can go back, also make these connections and not have to worry about what Kalina was saying. Okay, can I spend my money on art supplies or should I spend it on my next meal? I think. Yeah.
And Kalina, at a program like Tennessee State, is there an internship program or situation that somebody can go there and find internships that are both paid and unpaid?
Yeah, there's several internship programs kind of weaved throughout various departments. And then, we have kind of like a lot of other universities like career centers that help to connect students. And generally, it kind of works like everything else, where it's like, if a student makes a really good relationship with a faculty person, you're always going to have your eye out for that student and trying your best to kind of open doors wherever you can find them. So, a lot of us become mentors for our students and kind of work our butts off to, help to get them somewhere. So yeah. But I did want to kind of transition away from entry point into once we're there, once we're in the industry and we're working, what's going to keep us into these spaces? How do toxic environments contribute to the exit of, Black and brown and minority designers? And so, yeah, I don't know if anyone wants to chime in on that.
I can jump into that little hot potato. So I think there are a lot of really interesting things that we're talking about. And this is like the start of us kind of getting used to each other's points and talking about them. We're all making really great points. One, of course, there are, financial underpinnings to a lot of the things we do in our profession, specifically internships and fellowship opportunities, specifically relative to relocation. But of course, our profession involves the hustle. So anyone who wants to get in this profession has to understand that you just have to just absolutely stalk opportunities. And it's some kind of combination of those two things. But I think I want to, start talk about kind of away from deficit language towards what we're all building towards, because this is such a phenomenal panel. What we're really talking about is to truly take advantage of how diversity can propel a vibrant profession. Subculture is our greatest American export, right? So we're basically music industry, or we're profiting off of, whether, hip hop, streetwear, all these things. But how do we start to take advantage of the vibrant contributions from a design standpoint? So one of the things, to pick up of something that Bobby said is when you go to art school and you're learning about the canon of, the international style, and you're learning about Helvetica, 1957, Max Meeting Room, and you're starting to figure out what are all these things that people hold up in high regard that are in the permanent collection of the MoMA that are called design. These are the things your professional, colleagues are talking about. These are the framed objects that are in the lobby, and you're starting to say, is this the best that we can do? And so to go beyond surviving, where a lot of these spaces are centered in whiteness and the contributions of kind of the Eurocentric canon, how do you start to think about how we can paint this picture of a vibrant profession where the contributions and the perspectives from all these oblique angles can lead to superior, safer, outperforming objects? And really talking about cognitive diversity, the intersections of all of these things, beyond ableism. And so I think in terms of, professional dropouts, I do think there are a couple of things. A lot of companies are operating like vampires, unfortunately. I won't call them out, but they are looking at, tokenism and year-over-year matriculation statistics. So they're hiring not necessarily for the life cycle of these employees. They're actually looking at, the reports they're going to give back to the board at the end of the year. So those are some companies. Secondly, I think that the ERGs are oftentimes underfunded and undersupported within those companies. And so there's places where you're trying to find refuge in terms of things that are problematic in terms of language, in terms of a memo, things that start to feel like, oh, like I'm back to survival mode. Oftentimes, it's like we need an ERG, but we're not really supporting them. And I do think the conversations, a lot of times you're hiring for cultural fit. And I've often, held that this is a problem in art school, this is a problem in profession. Cultural fit basically means I see myself in you. Like when we are working late at night and I want to put on this playlist, you're not going to shake your head and say, I can't believe you put that song on. You're going to say, yeah, we're all vibing. We're all talking about the same things. We're completing each other's sentences. But cultural fit hiring leads to homogenous culture, and homogenous culture leads to some of the gaps that we're talking about. And so a lot of these things aren't immediately noticeable. Like, I was just hiring for somebody I wanted to have beers with or have a conversation with, but that's someone like you. And so these people would never say, I'm acting in either a kind of a racist or an anti-racist, kind of conscious way of behaving. But that's ultimately what cultural fit is. And so I think these are the things we have to kind of call out, and we have to say, but we're also not talking about, well, please give the poor guys the handout. We're talking about superior, dynamic, outperforming products. We're talking about like the most badass profession that we're building. Because if this panel was what the profession looked like, it would be amazing. But like, we've had to kill an ogre, climb a mountain, kill a dragon. So this panel is like, we should have to do what we had to do to get here. So it should be a little bit easier for people to get there. But these are just some initial thoughts.
Yeah, that's excellent. Yeah, I think implicit bias and so many other things, I mean, my gosh, they come into play in so many different ways. And I think that there's also, a stigma associated, honestly, with Black and Brown behaviors and people and cultures, and a lot of people don't recognize it, as you mentioned, as a problem. So again, I don't want to take over, but I'd love to hear what the others think about that. Bobby, you're unmuted, so I'm going to go.
Okay. Well, can you just start with repeating the question?
Yeah, so we were talking about kind of, what are originally kind of, what are some of the things that might create a toxic kind of environment that would contribute to the exit of Black and Brown and minority designers.
Yeah, I think, well, Forrest brings up a good point, is that we definitely had to go and kill a dragon to be in the places that we are. And like, it's shocking some of the things that I've done or friends of mine have done just to be able to survive. And I don't know if it's the culture of being in, in your 20s or being in New York City or whatever it was, but there were definitely places that seemed to really be kind of working against you. One, from the creative standpoint, I learned a lot of bad habits from places that I worked because the environments were so toxic, and I was trying to echo what was being done by my superiors. And so then I would treat people poorly. I would like look down on people, and the same with the client. And I had to unlearn those things when I wanted to start my own company, because we started our company to not do that, to do the exact opposite of that, and to be a company that is really inclusive of the people that we're working with and the people that we have working with us. And I had to put up with a lot of stuff. I remember an internship, actually, when I was in college. I had this 1.5 year long co-op internship with a Fortune 500 company in Norfolk, Virginia. And I was the only brother there that was in the design and creative area. There was another guy that worked down the hall. I think he was more an actuary or something. And we would vibe. We got along really well. But one of the things I remember is my supervisor was, he must have been a maybe 50-something-year-old white male. And I remember going on a 5-hour road trip to a printer in Roanoke, which is in the middle of Virginia. And the whole time, all he wanted to talk about politics. And he was a very conservative, older white man. And all he wanted to do was talk about his conservative views, and he wanted to get my point of view, but I refused to offer them. I just kind of listened to what he was saying, and then he would ask me a question. I would give a really short answer, and then we just keep going. And it's something that I look back on now, and I was like, it's insane. But I gained the experience of working with there, and I used that to kind of leverage me into other things. And I've never seen him since. And so I think there's, to me, looking back on it, that was a toxic environment, and I was maybe resilient enough to kind of get through it and use the opportunities that it offered to and take advantage of those. But there's so many people that won't put up with that shit and probably shouldn't. And I think a lot of the conversations that are being had in 2020 are finally looking at those types of scenarios and figuring out, like, hey guys, this is not right. Whether it's an organization, whether it's a corporation, whether it's a school, and being able to really instill values that come from an anti-racist, proactive point of view. I think, Forrest, you've mentioned this before, and I wholeheartedly believe that the advantage of being a US-based company and school, or just being an American, is our diversity. And I think that is it's what makes us better. I think the idea of empathy is bullshit. I think, we talk a lot about design thinking and trying to put yourself in other people's shoes. Instead, let's hire the people that are wearing the shoes that you want to put yourself in. And let's figure out how we can have this collection of different perspectives to make the work better and to make the culture better and make the environment better. And I think that's what we're trying to actively do on our end. And we're working with people that are doing that as far as our clients. But there's so many people, especially outside of New York, and as Trump wants to say, these red states and blue states, there's so many people that don't have these opportunities or have this access that have to deal with that stuff. And I don't know how to go about it. I just know that I kind of grit my teeth and got through it, and then used the opportunity that it allowed me to then, get to some place that was a little bit better later on.
So kind of to that point, and back to kind of what Forrest was getting to, what are some of those advantages of a more diverse industry?
I'm gonna let Jen go, because Jen, you got to jump in there. Jen is like, I'm off, my mic is on.
I'll just say, first thing is more creativity. I say we have an advantage of a society that is happier and more advanced, because we can be conscious of others and have the mental maturity to think outside our own head. And because design helps shape our society, if we can design our system to be more diverse and inclusive, then that just equates to more people feeling heard and included. So I believe an overall increase in our happiness and creativity.
Awesome, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I still love what Bobby was kind of getting at, about the empathy point. Empathy can only be empathy if it's everyone. Empathy that's not everyone is something like, maybe it's evil, right? Because it's the worst thing ever. It's saying that you're being empathetic, but you're actually looking at, the considerations of people that are, have prioritized needs. But I would agree with some of the things that Jen talked about as well, which is, when we talk about, the kindness, you can only be kind when you're understanding, the amount of harm that you can cause. And the more nuances, the multiple facets of how you can understand, how you can create harm, make sure that you're creating products, for instance, self-driving cars that can see, black skin because, they've been attuned to that because the LiDAR has been recalibrated, versus creating death machines, or the old Shirley card, right, that they used for photographic exposure. All these black photographers that I talked to were overexposing or underexposing because they were measuring against this, white skin, safeguard. And so it's just interesting to think about those things, to think about how many photographers, if they hadn't had the Shirley card, would be practicing photographers today, or to think about if empathy was everyone, how would we be designing superior products. But I think it's incredibly exciting. And I think it's important for us to paint a picture of diversity from a place of power, not from a place of deficit, because it's about incorporating many different vantage points and perspectives to create such nuanced contributions, the way that we see in jazz, the way that we see in other forms of creation, that are the benefits of having conversations with other forms of cultural production. But I'm incredibly excited by what we can create and what we can make. But I also think that it's important for people to also not get into the save the world with my whiteness type of fatigue. We really need to look at less quoting and more direct dialing, less of in the style of, and more like that person is just making the thing. And I think that that's on all of us, but I think it's important to look at forms of making that may be outside of what we're holding up. And one of the things that I would say, which is these are subtle points, but I wanted to provide some like exact microaggression examples, because I think we talk about microaggressions and everyone's like, oh, microaggression. I looked that up on Wikipedia. So like for instance, a lot of the meetings that I used to go to prior to COVID, when of course we were having in-person meetings, people would place the water in front of my colleague because they would assume that my colleague was the most senior person in the room. So they're so subtle. Now, of course, I have to acknowledge the microaggression, not be thrown by it because I have to lead this meeting. But it's all of those subtleties that, you're at the reception desk and who the security person looks to first. It's, how your badge is being checked at the checkpoint. It's who gets the water put down in front of them first. It's the questions about the AV check. So I might have 6 or 7 microaggressions before I even start a meeting, and that's like the top of the day. And so, for me, it's looking at microaggressions as a form of resistance. Like I'm going to the resistance of racism, where I'm basically becoming like a super athlete, becoming like an ultra marathoner, where I'm actually looking at microaggressions as providing a type of resistance for me to be more empathetic, but truly to be able to understand, some of these particular shortcomings. I also think that there is a style of critique, and Bobby mentioned this is a very important point. There's a difference between, I think, independent and interdependent cultures. So if you are raised within, Black, brown families, and I would also say, it's maybe in other cultures as well, where it's a critique of a community. It's a community critique, right? So it's not, a one-to-one kind of attack. I remember, my first experience of kind of like that New England style of independence is a critique that very much feels interrogative, that almost feels like it's an attack. But it's a way that people are attuned to having a dialogue, having a conversation. But if you're not used to a certain form of interaction or a certain type of critique, it can come across and be very damaging. And I think those are the cultural nuances of how we think about critiquing, how we think about complimenting, that are all, so nuanced in terms of who we are and where we come from.
Forrest, I told, man, you hit the nail on the head with a lot of that, man.
And so like, I guess in response to kind of those microaggressions though, like, have any of you guys felt the need to combat that by, hiding certain aspects of yourselves and your identity or kind of conforming to the majority in response to, microaggressions? Or even overt, or even more overt racist kind of behaviors?
I mean, I would say probably. What's the difference between conforming to the culture that's around you and being a professional and wearing, and dressing like for the job that you want, not for the job that you have? And like, what's the difference between kind of trying to be like the person who's running the show and standing up and doing all these exercises like you watch on a TED Talk, and like, I think to me there is the opportunity to kind of be yourself. And I think once I have gotten to a point in my career, I feel like I can be a bit more myself than I think when I was younger in my 20s. And in my 20s, I just tried to do as much as I possibly could. And my dad always, I think, to prepare me for the microaggressions and to prepare me for the racism and to prepare me for the often being overlooked, he really instilled this sense of over delivering. And so it's something that is really baked into the values of our company now, where to do good as a Black male in the country, we have to do more and we have to do it better. And so, he'll always say, if they ask you to write 500 words, you write 1,000. If they ask you to do 20 minutes, you do 40 minutes. And so that idea has really stuck with me And I think that's really what got me through my 20s and 30s. Well, I felt like nobody could work as late as I could. I could stay up longer than all of you, or nobody can do as many sketches as I can. And so it was always about maybe trying to prove myself versus and doing it in a way that most people would just kind of do what they need to and get out of the door. And I was always trying to do a little bit more and outlast everybody. And I don't know if it's the competitive nature of being kind of growing up in a sports town, or if it's this idea of just over delivering. But I've often felt that we needed to do more as Black folks and women than the average Joe. And I think because of that, those are some of the advantages that I was able to kind of reap some of the advantages of then, proving myself in that way. And but there's so many things that we encounter every day. I've just learned to look past them to get to, to think about the long game and the goal that I want to try to meet.
Yeah, I
think Bobby mentioned something really important, and I just want to say that ultimately we're fighting for the opportunity for there to be such thing as an average designer. I like to think that in many ways, like we're always talking about the Michelle Obamas of design, which is like, I did, 5 sketches when everybody else did 1, and I, stayed up late and I led the presentation. And I think ultimately, I think many of us fall into that category, but I think it's important that realistically, whenever I'm asked for advice on how to succeed, I have to realistically say the best advice I can give you is to overperform. And the reason is, if you are at parity, somebody is going to choose somebody because of cultural fit. You honestly have to outperform in order to be undeniably the best candidate, because the people that are going to defend that choice are not going to be you. They're going to be somebody who's saying, all things being equal, this work is better, or this effort is undeniably 150% versus 100%. And it's completely unfair, but we're dealing with, systemic racism. We're dealing with such, fault lines that I would have to say, realistically, if I'm being asked, in a one-to-one mentor-mentee situation, how to succeed, you have to overperform. Is that fair? That's not fair. Is it difficult? Yes. Is self-care important? Of course it is. But I think that's the most realistic thing in this very vulnerable and transparent conversation. If you just do what everyone else is doing, the other forces, the network effects, systemic racism, implicit bias, all those things will overwhelm, or they will mask a lot of these things we're talking about.
Yeah, thank you. That was that kind of answered one of the other questions about, how do we fight those deeply rooted systemic issues, and particularly if you're new in the industry. And, I think it becomes easier once you advance and you have a leadership position of some sort, and you can start to kind of implement some changes. But as someone new in the industry, how do you fight those kind of systemic things? I think Mitzi, I'm glad you're back, because I think you've done an excellent job of doing just that with your Where the Black Designers conference. So I don't know if you want to speak to that or not. And then after that, maybe we can move to some of the questions in the Q&A before we end.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Perfect, because my microphone's acting weird. But I think it just kind of goes to Forrest and Bobby's point is, I think, so we have to be brave into combating these things, because the questions that come up in terms of battling these things are just like, okay, is my job going to be affected if I say something, especially for, young designers like me who are just starting off their career, who don't see themselves in leadership, is just challenging to tap in these, white word of mouth networks. It's, at least for me, the feeling that I had when I started this conference into really, talking about all these topics and microaggression, was just the fact that it was no longer the question of just like, okay, should I do this because it's going to affect my career? It was just more just like, I'm going to do this. I don't care if it affects my career, because if it is, then I should probably be like not be working for some of these companies that are being like, no, you can't be working here because of what you're trying to say and whatnot. So I think there's a certain amount of bravery, but also, again, it just goes back to that whole, the fact that in this field, you're going to hustle to get to where, you know, Forrest is or Bobby is, and you just kind of have to have that tough skin to kind of do that. But I think it's great because we're in a time now where we can all come together and we're having conversations like these. I'm in front of a lot of people to help them understand that it's just like, one, we shouldn't be having these public conversations to say that. That's ridiculous in my opinion. And two, there's a lot of things that we have to do to basically combat all of these things in order not to have to make that decision about putting my career first versus, you know, over like how I feel or the well-being of like my identity and whatnot. So I don't know if I answered your question because I kind of forgot it along the way, but yeah, I think it just kind of reflects to what Forrest and Bobby have just been saying, and the fact that they kind of had to conform in their 20s because that's just kind of what I still have to do in order to get to, you know, these leadership positions up there, you know, and unfortunately.
Just to build on that last part, I think, you know, there's the 20s thing I mentioned because I was working in-house or working at an agency. And so those are the things I was dealing with because I was in those scenarios. I think the freedom that I have in starting my own company, it allows me to then get around a lot of that BS. However, then other issues start to be introduced. I start to ask questions like, well, why are we included on this request for proposals? Are we included as a token and we're not going to get the project anyway? Are we included because you really want to work with us? And then after we get the project, you know, then it's great. Sometimes we don't get the project. And so then I'm asking myself, did we not get the project because of, you know, I go through all these things and I'm asking why we didn't get the project. But some of it comes down to, is it because we're, you know, Black? Is it because we're women? Like what are the reasons why we didn't get those projects? So the issues that we're talking about here, unfortunately, don't stop after you get a fancy position. They just change, and they're looked at differently. And then all of that shit, you can be a CEO, Robert Smith, with $4 billion, and you walk into a lobby of some place and they say, oh no, messengers are around the back. So, you know, you still have to deal with that. It doesn't matter where you are in this country because we wear our Blackness as wherever we go.
Right.
Thank you. Let's we only have about 15 minutes, I guess, left. So I'll go to the Q&A. See a couple of questions here. So those of you that are wanting to ask the panelists questions, please do so, and I will do my best to get to a couple of them. So someone asked, Sherry Self asked, can you talk a bit about cultural influences, perhaps ones that you grew up with and were appreciated among your families, and how that contrasted to what you were taught was good design in design school, considering that many of our design educations were influenced by European styles. So how does your cultural influences contrast with what you were taught in design school?
That's a really good question.
I can start. Jet Magazine, the Black Bible. So that magazine was so transformative. One, because of the form factor, because it's smaller, it was intimate. One, because you just saw incredible covers and you saw people that didn't exist on the magazines that you saw when you're walking through, you know, basically any kind of souvenir shop. You had amazing kind of, you know, economy by which you could go through a Jet magazine. You could understand what are the top 10 songs or singles. You had the Jet Beauties. My dad actually shot Jet Beauties. He was a photographer for Jet magazine. But it was the original Jet covers are striking. I mean, it's beautiful design. You're talking about amazing kind of collaging of black and white photography with vibrant graphic palette. So for me, like, there was nothing more beautiful than Jet magazine. I didn't realize until much, much later, like Herbert Temple and some of the people that brought this to life, and Johnson Publishing Company. But Jet magazine was one of those things that I think, I look back on it, and it was an early introduction to very amazing design by the hands of Black designers.
Thank you. That brings back memories. Go ahead.
I think I can go next. That's a really good question because in terms of cultural influence, for me, traveling back to my parents' country and like seeing how design is treated differently, and it's more just treated on a level of like what's functional and what's not, just kind of really really caused me to ask questions about what is considered to be good design versus like bad design. And even then, we just had a recent conversation in our community with the initiative Design to Divest, which I recommend you guys go check out, about what is good design and what is bad design, and how we shouldn't really be asking that question of like what is good design and bad design, that we should kind of be asking like what is functional versus what is like not functional, who is it helping, asking questions of just like, okay, if I'm going to design something for somebody, asking questions about who that person is, right? And then asking questions about, okay, is what I'm designing for that person going to be dangerous because of who they are going to be giving it to? And I also kind of got into the design game pretty late. I would probably say a few years ago. So I myself am still learning about that. But because I went to a predominantly white institution and because all of this is happening, but I also want to kind of put in my narrative, I'm kind of asking myself, how am I, contributing to this whole notion of what is to be considered good design, when that is, I feel like, at least what I've learned, is really rooted in white supremacy, I think. So I'm just more going through an introspective path right now of just trying to figure out that contrast. Yeah.
I think the question about good design and bad design is problematic. And so you see it happen in a lot of different ways, and those conversations still be really held up by journalists, which I find to be a problem. What I kind of go back now and look at some of the things that I learned in college, a lot of that was around communication and clarity and hierarchy and scale and contrast. And those things, what I really cherish about those is I find that they do help with the effective and the function of certain things. I'm talking graphic design more than UX UI. The thing that I also want to make sure, and I think this really comes through in those original Jet magazine covers especially, is the opportunity for creativity and for artfulness and craft. And so in my company, the way that I've been trying to think about it is, making sure that things are functioning and clear, but that's not enough. How can we also really move people and engage people and hopefully have some type of emotional reaction? And what we're able to do now in 2020, which we may not have been able to do in 1990, is have references like original Jet magazines and album covers and posters and have the influence of hip hop and the amazing album covers that came out of the 80s and early 90s of hip hop, and how that can then influence the things that we're doing today. I think that we have the opportunity to now look at how we can broaden those influences and how those influences of just the things that are around the house can impact, what we do as graphic designers, still kind of leveraging the kind of clarity of communication.
Thank you. And since we are kind of running a little short on time, and I'll open it up for the panelists to just give any last words or any advice, anything that we didn't get a chance to really talk about that you really just want to make sure that gets said here today. So there's already been a lot, but yeah, Jen.
Hey. So advice I guess I would give would be, don't be afraid to create your own path, especially when there's not a lot of representation out there for you to reference. And there's a lot more out there that's available to you that you don't know. So don't be scared of the unknown, and just know that you can't fail if you show up every day and do the work. And also, while you're putting your head down and doing that work, don't forget to take care of yourself. You can't put a value on your mental health and it's such an important aspect to our daily grind for your mind and body to be at peace. And that's just something I've learned about myself over the years. If I don't feel right, it's really hard for me to get work done and open my mind to creative thinking. So just remember to check in with yourself.
Thank you, Jen.
I'll go next. Thank you, Jen. I think if you're going to fail, you should fail, absolutely. I think the worst thing you can do is stumble, because when you stumble, you just regain your gait and you're basically looking in the same direction. But if you truly fail and you find yourself on the floor, you're going to see a perspective that you didn't think was possible. And I think it's only failure if you don't learn something.
Thank you, Forrest. I'm going to write that one down. That was awesome. All right, Bobby, Mitzi?
Sure. I really appreciate being part of this panel today, and I thought I've learned a lot from being on here. And I think the idea of failing is something that a lot of us, encounter all the time. So I'm glad you bring it up for us. And it's kind of cliche, but I think so much of it really depends on what you do after you experience these macroaggressions and the microaggressions and just the kind of racism or the opportunities that you fell short on, not because of things that you weren't doing on your end, but because of how other people were viewing you or viewing the work. Get up and do it again and do it again. I think the kind of relentlessness and the resilience is so important. And there's so many times when myself and people that I've worked with have made really big failures. And then the thing is, I've learned that this is a marathon. It's not a sprint. And I used to think that we needed to get everything done as quickly as possible in my 20s and then in my 30s. And now I realize this is the same old shit every day. So we just have to figure out how to get up and move beyond, what experience we had today and figure out what we can do better and differently tomorrow and keep going at it. We talked a little bit about cost and money, and I know that that's a major challenge. And so, on the organizations that I've been a part of, it's something that we have often as part of the discussion, whether it's entry fees for participating in an event or whatever it may be. I've had the opportunity to sit on a couple of design organizations' boards, and the conversations that we have can continue to get better and are often, I'm often the one or the only, maybe a couple of Black folks on those boards. What we want to do and need to start doing is having those boards of those organizations, the participants of those organizations, be more like the panel that we have today. And I really admire the work that Mitzi's doing and the conferences and the conversations that are being had. At the Type Directors Club at the TDC, I was able to introduce a scholarship of $5,000 that we're able to give to a designer that is really interested in typography. This is a person who has to be in college. They have to be no later than a junior in college or the first year in grad school. And we're basically giving away $5,000. We're going to launch that scholarship the second year in December. So I encourage all of you that are on this call to enter, if you're still in school, to enter and get that money, because there are resources out there. We can do better about making more resources. And those are the things that I'm doing now that I'm on some of these boards or in these places. I'm trying to figure out what we can do to actually make this gap a little bit smaller and hopefully amplify the voices and amplify, all of you. So definitely continue to look for those types of things, and I'll do everything I can to try to get that money in your hands.
Thank you, Bobby. And Mitzi, you have the last word here.
Yeah, my microphone's wonky, so I'm going to be super quick. +1 to everyone. I feel like there's no advice for me left to give because everyone just nailed it and said what I was going to say. And yes, to Bobby, we actually amplified that scholarship in our community, which is really, really cool. So yeah, there's so many resources available. I think even the great thing about building this platform is just meeting everybody, whether it's today or even in the past. got to know Forrest, which I'm always fangirling whenever I'm in the same room as him. But through this platform and whatnot, I've just met so many amazing people. So there is a community out there, and I recommend that you go and find it, because there's so much great support and so many people doing amazing work to, again, close this gap of what Bobby said. So yeah, it's out there, and even to like allies, those resources are out there too. Like, people are doing the work to educate everybody and empower everybody to just really push the agenda and combat racial injustice, especially within the creative and tech space. So yeah.
Thank you. This was a really amazing conversation. I really appreciate everyone's time, and you guys that are attending here today and blowing up the chat. So I appreciate that. And Bobby did put the information in the chat for the Type Directors Club scholarship. So check that out. And I think that's it. Thank you, guys. We'll see you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.